Guys, I'm so excited to have Brittany Gibson on Bad Faith podcast today. I was able to speak to her briefly on Rising earlier this week about this really blockbuster story that she wrote over at Politico that has to do with one of the most hotly watched elections in the country right now. Welcome to Bad Faith, Brittany.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so this story is titled Abrams, as in Stacey Abrams, campaign chair collected millions in legal fees from voting rights organization. Verified Action, the nonprofit founded by Abrams, paid her close friend and ally's law firm $9.4 million in 2019 and 2020, with 2 more years of billing yet to be disclosed. Brittany, is this a Black Lives Matter scandal part 2?
I wouldn't go that far, just because, at least in this case, so Fair Fight Action, they raised $61 million to advance their cause of voting rights and fighting voter suppression. This lawsuit was voting rights related. It was about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, First, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So it also had the potential to change voting laws in Georgia. So it's not the same as buying. If I'm remembering the Black Lives Matter story accurately, the headquarters was the founders at the headquarters were buying their own homes and paying their family members to be consultants and not doing work to advance the Black Lives Matter mission, fighting police brutality, improving the lives of Black people. So they were totally off the board, not even doing anything close to what Black Lives Matter
TikTok house, ostensibly to, I don't know, galvanize the kids to action on the apps or something.
Yeah, exactly. So, this case, it did have a lot of potential. And I think what, we can see now with, now that this all started with a case from 2018, one that Stacey Abrams filed at the end of the last governor's race. And if remembering back to 2018, I wasn't covering that race at the time. I was actually still in college. So I was at a distance compared to where I am now. But I remember seeing those long lines, viral videos, people voting well into the night, especially in minority areas. I remember reading those news stories about voter registration forms not being processed in time for election day. And I think there's something there to that. And Georgia election officials have admitted, we had problems with long lines. We really worked hard to stop that in the 2020 election. And to a certain degree, they did. I think the average wait time for in-person voting on election day in 2020 was 3 minutes. And for the 2020 runoff was 1 minute. So Georgia election officials, they did recognize they had issues in their state. And obviously Stacey Abrams did too when she launched this lawsuit.
So do you think that the lawsuits helped to lead to election reforms in any kind of direct linear way?
Well, then I think that's where it gets more gray. I don't believe that the lawsuit was what changed things in Georgia. Fair Fight Action would push back against that. They said, and we quote them in the story, saying that because of the lawsuit, they were able to get the state to use a different program to verify newly naturalized citizens who have registered to vote. So more people don't get caught up in the "are you a citizen? Can you please, bring your extra documents before you vote" situation. And then they also, because of an earlier claim in the case that did not make it to trial, they got the state to tweak a little bit their exact match formula when the state runs a check of the statewide voting rolls. And 22,000 people who would have been flagged weren't flagged.
Okay.
But those are really small things compared to the scope of this initial case. And then we can talk about
Yeah, please. So just to reorient people, the issue here, the relationship between the underlying lawsuit and what Stacey Abrams is being accused of is that not that the lawsuits themselves necessarily were in bad faith or that they couldn't have had a positive result, but that the amount spent on said lawsuits was really disproportionate to how much is typically spent on suits of this nature. And that her friend, as a partner or associate, or is she, what is her role at the firm?
She's the founding partner. And
the founding partner.
Counsel in this case.
Okay. So obviously stands to benefit very directly from all of the money that is being spent on this lawsuit. As an attorney, being someone who quote unquote brings business to the firm is kind of your best calling card. That is what enables you to make partner. That is your value to the firm, is your ability to bring in business. So even though it's not literally a one-to-one, $9.4 million in my pocket, the value of a partner is to be able to do what her friend has facilitated, which is not just to bring the case to the firm, but to bring a case that apparently has cost more than other similarly situated cases have to this firm. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And so, because of the Brnovich decision in 2020, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund actually did a study of cases similar to the Fair Fight case, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act cases. Their study went and looked back at cases going all the way up to 2021, so pretty current. And they found that the most expensive case of this sort was a case in Texas that was about $8.8 million. And that was like most expensive by far. The norm for this case, according to Legal Defense Fund, is, a couple $100,000 over a couple of years. They've seen some cases recently get into the millions, but those are like the most expensive. I talked to some other attorneys as well. Mark Elias, a very popular Democratic side attorney, talked to some attorneys just in general that do election rights work, and they were all very surprised to hear that number. The quote in the story from the person that did that study for Legal Defense Fund, she said at the time of our interview, like $10 million would be shocking at this point. And so Fair Fight Action, their total legal fees so far, from what we can see, 2019 and 2020, have been $25 million.
Wow. So more
Which
than twice
makes
would be more than twice the number that people said would be a high outlier number.
exactly. And that's just 2 years of the case. So we can start to request, we being the public, definitely myself, I will request these, the 990 forms for 2021 in about a month, in November. So there's this 9-month kind of delay with the IRS of, they file their taxes for 2021 and then you can request them, in November. And then we can get the 2022 numbers, which is the year that the case actually went to court, when they were in the bench trial in 2023.
Okay, so remind us a little bit, if you could give us some more background about what these underlying cases were and what even came of them for all of that money that was spent.
Mm-hmm. So the initial case, the one filed in 2018, was really broad. It had about 20 claims, and they ranged from everything from the state not having the right resource allocation leading to long polling lines, the changing and closing of polling places, specifically in minority areas. They had a claim in there that I totally forgot from at the time, but they had a claim in there saying that the voting machines were unreliable and were switching votes for Abrams to Kemp. And, a whole bunch of other things about IDs, things about, the voting issues that we are kind of more common knowledge today.
Mm-hmm.
The defense side asked for a summary judgment, which basically would ask the judge, what is there enough evidence for in this case? And the judge came back in early 2021 and said, there's enough evidence to have trial to progress on 3 smaller claims. And those were the training of poll workers to help people cancel an absentee ballot and vote in person. It was the exact match system that the state uses, uh, which mostly will impact people that don't register through the automatic voter registration at the DMV. So when you get your license or non-driver's license in Georgia, you also automatically get registered to vote. And then it also the final claim was the accuracy of the voting rolls on election day. And so it was questioning how the state maintains those rolls when they do things like a check for felons. So if you have the same name as a felon that lives in the same county as you, for example, you could be flagged as maybe you're that felon, you shouldn't be on the voting rolls. So those are the 3 things that remained. And on September 30th, after 21 trial days, I was told that it was the longest voting rights trial in that court in Georgia, the Northern District Federal Court. The judge ruled in favor of the defendants, in favor of the state on all 3 claims.
And what has been the response to that ruling? There's been a lot of conversations about whether this judge or that judge is biased. Are they a Trump appointed judge? That is not necessarily always a fair accusation to make just because of who appointed them. But do people feel like the outcome was expected, if not basically valid?
It's kind of mixed. So just about the judge, it was Judge Stephen Jones. He is actually an Obama appointed judge. He seemed to, I was in court a couple of days. He seemed to have a relationship, or like at least like a working relationship with both Allegra Lawrence Hardy and some of the attorneys on the defense side. Like it was a
Mm-hmm.
very amicable courtroom.
Mm.
I've been told by people that this was probably fair fight actions. Um, I don't know if it's legally okay to say this, but like the friendliest courtroom that they would have had, because if they chose to appeal, they have not said whether they will appeal this decision or not. It would go to the 11th District Court, which I'm told is a little more conservative, more Trump
Mm-hmm.
appointed judges.
Mm-hmm.
So this was their best shot in the courtroom,
Yeah.
is what I've been told. Um, and the response is, if imagine you're Brian Kemp right now, and the Attorney General's, Chris Carr, is also in the same boat because the Attorney General's office provides the legal support for anyone that sues the state. So technically they sue the Secretary of State's office, but that ties in the Attorney General's office. There's, kind of taking a victory lap and saying, see, we told you there's no mass voter suppression. We told you everything is fine here in Georgia, and now a judge proved it. Um, and
Yeah,
that's
that's a lot of eggs put into that one basket because the narrative
mhm.
really out of Georgia. Stacey Abrams' whole career basically has been claim after claim that she was unfairly denied her original 2018 victory.
I do have one very affirmative statement to make. We won.
You refused to concede and say that you lost. Do you stand by that decision today?
Absolutely. The election was not fair. The process was not fair.
You notably did not concede.
I did not.
Okay.
And I was a new reporter like yourself, a little longer in the tooth back in 2018, but new to the profession. And remember covering that story in the early days when Stacey Abrams, to be honest, despite having critique from the left from the beginning for her attitude toward the Hope free college program, facilitating cutting that program as a deal with Republicans in the state. Feeling like she had stepped away. A lot of progressives felt like she had backtracked from some of the progressive bona fides that she had demonstrated in college. There's a picture of her burning the American flag and all that sort of thing. She'd become a much more moderate politician. But I did believe that she was a very shrewd and capable politician and looked forward to seeing what she could accomplish. But her record really has been about all these consecutive failures. I mean, who knows what will happen this time around, but the polls don't look good. And so much of not just her own personal persona, but the Democratic Party's kind of legitimacy in the face of Trumpism has hung on this idea that elections were stolen. And now Republicans are really turning the screw. I'm sure you saw Ted Cruz on The View last week pushing back against the co-hosts of The View who were saying Trump election denialism is a problem. It's the big lie. And Ted Cruz, which it is a problem. And then Ted Cruz responds, well, look at Hillary Clinton and all of these other people, Stacey Abrams, who've been saying, well, the election was stolen from me as well. So how can you say that saying that elections were stolen were a problem?
You can run the best campaign. You can even become the nominee. And you can have the election stolen from you. Trump knows he's an illegitimate president.
The president or elect, although legally elected, is not legitimate.
I don't see this president-elect as a legitimate president.
One thing that Trump is fearful of when it comes to his being president is that finally we will see how illegitimate his victory actually was.
I have an objection.
I object to the 15 votes from the state of North Carolina. I object because people are horrified.
He's an illegitimate president.
In the middle of all of that, Stacey Abrams' lawsuit, the Fair Fight lawsuit, coming up with nothing is a significant blow to the arguments Democrats have been making about why they can't win.
Yeah, absolutely. And I honestly, I did not realize how big an issue this was, especially when I talk to Republicans and every interview I've done this year with people in Georgia about, will these Trump endorsed candidates accept the election results, especially around the primary, because Trump had endorsed a whole slate of people to run against the Republican incumbents in the state. I would ask people, consultants or the campaigns themselves, will you accept the election results? And a lot of them would bring up that, it's not just us, it is, look at Stacey Abrams. She's an election denier on the
Mm-hmm.
ballot too. And, I don't know how to compare the two kinds of
Mm-hmm.
election denial. Honestly, it's something I think about. But Abrams did say repeatedly that she does not concede. She, said it in different speeches around 2018 and 2019. Not today, but back then, I actually won this election. And, she did say things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I honestly, I don't know how to compare those. I think I'm thinking about it,
Yeah.
but
It's tough because 1/6 happened, right? And so that feels like an escalation, and Trump's encouragement of the protesters to storm the Capitol feels like an escalation. I wonder if there would be more openness among Democrats to accept that there are some parallels between everyone basically claiming that elections were stolen from them when they feel like they lost unfairly. If 1/6 hadn't happened and Trump had just showed up at the inauguration and not continued to foreground the quote unquote big lie as much as has been done. Because it does get a little bit difficult. Now, another place where I would argue there's a meaningful distinction between, Hillary Clinton or whomever saying, I should have won, or that the 2000 election was stolen or decided by the Supreme Court wrongly, is that there were these attempts at election interference by calling up Raffensperger and these people in the state of Georgia in particular to try to get them to not certify the election results. And another story that you wrote recently had to do with the fact that even though Brian Kemp is, I think, being largely tolerated by even Democrats in the state as a relatively moderate conservative who was not an election denier, not a Trump truther, his lieutenant governor, in fact, was. Can you tell us a little bit more about that person?
yes, absolutely. So the lieutenant governor candidate, which is a separate election, you vote for governor and lieutenant governor separately in
Mm.
Georgia. His name is Burt Jones, and he's a state senator who, in the aftermath of the 2020 election, was one of the fake electors in Georgia that sent their own, I guess, submission to the Electoral College. I
Yeah,
don't know
just
if they
as a
actually made it to the
reminder, like
Electoral College.
what is a fake elector? What does that mean to be a
Yes.
fake elector?
So it was one of the legal ideas from the Trump camp at that time to try and
Mm-hmm.
maintain power that the elections were not run properly. So there is this legal loophole that there can be an alternative slate of electors. And apparently this happened in Hawaii in, I think, like the 1960s. They might have had some sort of natural disaster and they didn't have an election or something like that. They found some example. I honestly was not too read into it until I found out that Burt Jones was running, because he is the only person who was a fake elector who decided, I will participate. I will, put my name on this fake slate from Georgia to be running for statewide office in the country now. And so Georgia had a slate of fake electors, but there was also a team of people in coordination with the Trump campaign in Michigan and Pennsylvania and other states across the country trying to change their state's results from Biden to Trump.
Okay. And so one of these fellows who quite obviously is quite ideologically aligned with Trump and has demonstrated an openness to playing fast and loose with election results is in line to be lieutenant governor.
Exactly.
Separate and apart from whether or not Brian Kemp wins.
Exactly, yes. So you could have a situation where, for example, Stacey Abrams does win the governorship, and then Burt Jones is the lieutenant governor. And lieutenant governor in Georgia also is the president of the state senate. So they don't have a direct role. They're not a voting member of the state senate. It's not like the U.S. Senate where you can like break ties and things like that. But they do get to, depending on the state legislature's rules that session, they do have some influence in assignment committees. So, for example, or I shouldn't say the only reason Burt Jones is running, but the current incumbent lieutenant governor who got elected with Kemp back in 2018, Jeff Duncan, decided not to run. He's also in this kind of anti-Trump or not favorable of Trump Republican wing. And in response to Burt Jones being a fake elector, he removed him from his chairmanship on a committee. So that's the kind of power that you would have as lieutenant governor / president of the Senate in Georgia.
So what are the polls looking like for the lieutenant governor race?
Also favoring Republicans, but the last poll I saw from, I believe it was Quinnipiac, ranked the race as a statistical tie. So Burt Jones was still ahead, but they said not biased, in terms of the mathematics of it, it was a tie.
See, okay, this is what's so frustrating. This is another nail biter, which, I'm not going to say it shouldn't be, because maybe, I think it was an easier get for Stacey Abrams back in 2018 when she wasn't fighting incumbency. But I think there's a world in which she's a competent politician in many ways, even despite my disagreements with her on various issues. And it is frustrating to see these kinds of outcomes, especially because it does start to feel, and I'm uncomfortable, I got to say, saying this as a Black person, but it does start to feel like the voter access issues, voter suppression issues have been used as a Band-Aid for some bigger problems here. And that in different ways, but in comparable ways, the way that the conservatives have been claiming that elections were stolen is used to disguise the extent of their own failures. Democrats pointing specifically to disenfranchisement, particularly of communities of color, has been a placeholder that's prevented them from engaging in some of these substantive issues.
I talk about my grandmother and the fact that when she had the first chance to vote in 1968, she was afraid to do so because she remembered what and how vicious voter suppression felt. And she was not afraid that she didn't have the right. She was afraid to use that right. And so the work that we're doing through Fair Fight 2020, Fair Fight Action, and the reason I wrote the book is so we can confront the fears and start to work on enlisting people in fighting back.
So you have, reporting that Stacey Abrams in particular is having a struggle with Black men. And when you get these men on the streets, these direct interviews that you have with a lot of people, they bring up specific concerns about the weird flip-flopping on, funding the police more. They don't know, half the world is mad at her for believing that she's a defund the police candidate, and half of people who are, I think, more solidly in her base and who she should care about are mad at her for saying that she wants to raise police salaries.
We need to pay a living wage in Georgia, and that is what my proposal says. And I know a living wage to our public safety workers, just as I want to pay to our teachers.
And it's like a lose-lose situation. And all the while, this a very important issue, which is voter rights access, is being used as kind of this bully pulpit to prevent her from having to engage in the fact that she's not actually delivering or communicating effectively to the people who are in her base already.
I think it's a really interesting point. I actually, I did a reporting for a story that Politico, it didn't get published, but about Black male voters and, how she's losing that support, and went to a couple of her campaign events, one of which, it was exactly what you just described. She was talking about, I want to raise pay for teachers, I want to raise pay for public service sectors. And then she said, and you might not clap at this, but I want to raise pay for police officers too. And she was right. No one clapped. This was at her event. So yeah, she does have that dynamic. The only thing I would add to that is, from what I've seen, and I'm based in Washington, I'm not in Georgia all the time, but from what I've seen is she's not talked about voting rights as much as I thought she would on the campaign trail this year. Not directly, at least not, if you look at, her tweets, you look at her press releases, her emails and things like that, it's not been the issue. It's not been top of mind the way I thought it would be. I really did think this would be one of her main pillars, but she's been more focused on, things like Medicaid expansion and public schooling.
Well, do you think that's because she's lost these cases, which were kind of her linchpin for her argument?
I don't know. And so one of the things that I asked Allegra Lawrence-Hardy, actually, when I interviewed her and thought about a lot during the trial, is when Abrams launched this case, she was not a direct plaintiff, Fair Fight Action was, but she was at the press conference launching it. She was, she talked about it. This whole year, Abrams has not really mentioned Fair Fight Action at all. She did a tweet thread about the verdict, did not mention Fair Fight Action by name. She didn't promote the case when the trial started. She wasn't at the press conference at the end of the first day of trial, which was just like opening hearings and the start of one witness. She really has kept her distance from Fair Fight Action in general. And to be fair, yeah, she did resign from the board, but that's the organization she founded. So I was a little surprised, and it was the trial that she launched after her election experience. So yeah, I was surprised she kept her distance.
I mean, look, I was listening to an episode of Pod Save America recently for research purposes, and they had an episode about what was going on in Georgia, and they interviewed a number of people, Simone Sanders and a number of activists in the state. And what was striking to me is that despite Pod Save typically being a format where they were all for advice to the Democratic Party, but it generally doesn't come in the form of kind of like a pointed criticism. I mean, sometimes it does. I don't want to be unfair, but it tends to be like they should do this, or I don't know why they're doing this. The guest on that particular episode had a little bit more edge in their voice, and they talked about how they felt that a lot of money was coming into the state. A lot of donations were coming in to, Stacey Abrams and her efforts. Again, this is a $25 million lawsuit here. That's a lot of money that could be spent to finance a lot of door knocking and a lot of grassroots efforts. But in fact, that has not happened. And they say that they are woefully underfunded there, despite pulling miracles out of their hat repeatedly, like they did in 2020, basically single-handedly, and again, without funding, securing the state for Joe Biden, who has then subsequently not taken the power of having majorities in the House and the Senate, or tie-broken majorities in the Senate, to enact the kind of legislation that was on the ballot. So the $2,000 checks that were explicitly promised to Georgia if he won never came through. It became a $1,400 check. The promise to cancel all HBCUs, Atlanta being a hub of several major HBCUs, never came through. All HBCU debt was on the table, and he could have done that instantly by executive order. Instead, he's decided to do this means-tested program, which is now being challenged in the courts and may not come to fruition for anybody at all, much less HBCU students. And on and on and on. And I remember listening to an activist at the time in 2020 give an interview, I believe it was on Cornel West's Tightrope podcast, saying, like, we can't do this again. We're not going to be able to convince people to come out telling them how important it was and how much they were going to get if there's no follow-up. And I think the most striking part about this story, and in some ways even more so than I wouldn't say more so than the Black Lives Matter story, but comparably striking in this situation, is that there does seem to be people raising money under the auspices of helping very specific groups of people and getting specific political outcomes, which in fact were secured, and then turning around and offering these groups absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I guess Black voters are expected just not to say anything about it. The occasional one who does, the Ice Cube, sticks his head up and gets called a Trump voting crazy pants. Joe Biden, the president of the United States of America, told Black people, you ain't Black if you don't vote for me.
Well, I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't Black.
In the face of this kind of malfeasance, and it's Black people. It's people like Stacey Abrams is the face of this kind of betrayal.
That I need to listen to that episode, because what I got I talked to the other very big groups in Georgia and asked, like, what was your experience working like with Fair Fight in 2020? And they said, their role was not being the grassroots organizer. They were kind of okay with that. They said, she is our connection to the coast, to California donation money, to New York, DC donation money. And they were kind of comfortable with that. So I want to.
But did the money get to them is the question.
Well, so this is the interesting thing. This is a little nerdy, but bear with me. So the 990 forms, there's a section where, because it's pretty common for a nonprofit group to give grants out to other organizations. So through the 501c4, which is the nonprofit organization, they didn't give any grants to, or they gave out some grants, but they didn't give them to like the New Georgia Project or for Galeo, which is like a Latino elected officials group. There was a couple song, which is Southerners on New Ground. They didn't give those donations through the nonprofit. They gave them through their PAC, which is just a regular federal PAC. They file quarterly with the FEC. And in the 990 forms, what kind of stood out to me, and there's just one line about this in the story, is that at the end of 2020, they have to report their like end of year bank balance, and they had $20 million in the bank. And so they raised 61 million in 2019 and 2020. About 25 million of that was on legal fees, spent on legal fees, and then $20 million was left in the bank. And that their explanation to me for that was, we had to prepare for the next legislator session in Georgia. And obviously in the next legislation session, you got SB 202, but that $20 million did not stop SB 202. That was the next voting law, and it is passed and it's in place for this election year. So I don't know if there are groups in Georgia that are upset that they didn't get a cut of the pie, for example, of the money. That's pretty interesting to me.
I think that is the real similarity here with the Black Lives Matter group, is that there are Black Lives Matter groups all over the country that aren't the obviously national leadership group, who are doing work in communities and are really pulling their weight. And now they feel like the BLM name has been tarnished in this way. And they've been really struggling at the same time. That's, yes, even with BLM, I think it was $90 million that were raised, and 30 million unaccounted for and 60 million in the bank. There's still a lot of money that is still in a bank somewhere, with the entire BLM leadership having kind of abandoned ship. Nobody wants to be in charge. It's truly a leaderless organization at this point. I think nobody wants to be caught like holding the hot potato. And at these moments of crisis, it feels really irresponsible for that money not to be going to people in need when it was raised on the argument that it was going to the most vulnerable populations in the world and kind of extracted from well-meaning folks across the country for the most noble of purposes. Now, I should say that, it is perfectly possible that with more investigation and more disclosures, we find out that the lawsuits were so expensive because they were so high profile. I've kind of gone over what the national import of these races were in terms of the Democratic Party messaging around the election having been stolen. And even if we think it's somewhat excessive, it could be that there's no actual malfeasance, I guess, that has happened here. What do you think that we are likely to find when people start pressing the question more specifically? Where did the money go and why so much money?
Yeah, honestly, I really don't know. And I've, I do try and remain open to all possibilities. What I hope is just to show this is just a transparency story from my perspective. I just hope to show people these are the numbers. I had to dig for them. I had to know I could look through them through these public filings to the IRS and things like that. But I think there's a couple of questions you could ask. You could ask, should this money have been spent on this lawsuit? I think that's the first one. And it was the election law blog professor, Rick Hasson. He had a post maybe more than a year ago now about Mark Elias, kind of critiquing, his strategy for bringing certain voting rights cases. And this is way past, I'm just a Wikipedia level lawyer, so this is way past my expertise on how a lawyer.
The secret is that so many lawyers are just Wikipedia level lawyers.
That might be true. But there apparently is a strategy for if you want to crystallize a law, or if you want to challenge and chip away at something, you pick the perfect case with the perfect plaintiff. And there's some
you don't want bad law on the books. Yeah, you don't want to establish bad
Exactly.
precedent.
Exactly. So there's a calculus to picking your cases. And, I would love if there are any, election law people that think maybe this was not the most strategic case to pick, to hear that perspective. So I think that's a question. I think, it still remains Fair Fight could turn around and say, okay, so this is how much we spent on the case, and this is why, and this is what the billing rate was, and this is why it all makes perfect sense. And I think that would be perfectly acceptable too. So I don't know. I think a lot is still unanswered. I kind of took apart the remote control, but I haven't put it back together. So I don't really. Yeah, I think a lot could still come of this, and I think there are fair questions to still be asked.
I wonder, because I interviewed the young man Sean Campbell, who broke the story open about the BLM protest in New York Magazine, and he got a lot of backlash for it. A lot of people have been trying to say some things about BLM for a while. I think that because he was a Black man, frankly, finally kind of having a story in a high profile outlet, one that has a Black female editor, I should note, over at New York Mag. But because he had that kind of veneer of unimpeachability that race sometimes brings you, and because he was not so easily discarded as a bad faith conservative who was just trying to bring down the organization for ideological reasons, it broke through. But also he got a lot of liberal pushback, and I wonder what response you've gotten so far to your reporting.
Yeah, I did feel the same way. And part of why I knew about Fair Fight Action was because in 2020, I was a fellow at the American Prospect magazine, and my beat for the whole year was voting rights and voter suppression. So like I felt pretty knowledgeable about the issues that Fair Fight was trying to address, even going into thinking about reporting this story. I was prepared by my editors, by people at Politico, colleagues and friends for some negative pushback. I was expecting to be critiqued for my race, for a Black woman going after another Black woman. But I honestly did not see much of that. And granted, my response to them at the time was always, well, I'm not really that popular on Twitter, so I'm not too worried about it, which is true, as you've probably seen. But the worst thing I've seen is someone said that we darkened Stacey Abrams' skin color in that lead graphic photo. I think that's a little unfair. It's just a black and white photo versus a color one. So any black and white photo, the grayscale will be darker. But that was the absolute worst of it. And what I saw a lot of that, not in a negative way, but like I thought was kind of interesting was people saying, well, what about Trump? What about Trump? Trump paid Rudy Giuliani to be his lawyer too. And I think that's, an interesting comeback to this story. I want to look at Trump's finances too. I look at Save America PAC every quarter. So that's kind of my response to that. But overwhelmingly, it's been a positive response, at least in the Twitter space. And then I've heard from some sources that the story got shared around really well in Georgia, that a lot of lawyers read the story. I heard from one source, which is kind of exciting. I don't know exactly what the lawyer chatter is, but cool that they're reading it. But yeah, I really, I just see this as a transparency story. I just showed what, you have to dig to find. And I think people were interested in seeing that. And it didn't blow back on me the way I was prepared for, which, is kind of lucky, I guess. I should knock on wood or something. But
well, look, Brittany, it's really great reporting. People should go to Politico and read the whole story, and also follow you on Twitter so you get in more trouble next time, and really follow your work, because you've done great, and you're so young to have, I love the American Prospect. I love to hear that you were there. Shout out to David Dayan, friend of the show. Congratulations for being at Politico and having the platform to break big, important stories like this. I really look forward to hearing more from you and about your career. Oh, but before I let you tell people on the internet where to find you, I wonder if you think that part of the reason why there wasn't the same level of backlash is because, what is your read on how kind of organic the appreciation for Stacey Abrams is outside of the Beltway? How real the love for her is? And I don't mean this, I'm not saying everyone should hate Stacey Abrams or anything of the sort, but it does seem to me that there was a definite kind of media push to make her a thing in the same way that Pete Buttigieg had that kind of halo effect around him, despite not having a lot substantively on the accomplishment roster in terms of actually winning elections. She's been presented as the next vice president of the United States, asked whether she's going to have a presidential run, was considered to be kind of a shoo-in for this Senate seat at various times, has prominent spots in the Democratic world. And I wonder how much of that is perhaps a figment that is being revealed by the fact that she doesn't have as many real world defenders as one might think.
That's a really interesting question. I honestly had not thought about that before, or thought about it in that way before. I don't have a great answer for that. I will say what I have seen her on the campaign trail, I think she really connects with people. She's got a really incredible stump speech that like even touched me at a little point. I was like, oh wow, that's really, she's a great she's pretty good on the campaign trail. I think that connects with people. She also, because she founded so many nonprofit groups, Fair Fight Action is not her only one. She's got a good circle, or at least a semi-large circle, I guess you could say, around her, that I think helps drum up support for her. Maybe the results of this election will have a better answer. Well, we'll show a better answer, especially if Raphael Warnock in the Senate race wins and she loses.
Yeah.
That would maybe say a little more than. But yeah, no, I had not thought about it that way in terms of she did get a lot of, still does, national media attention. She would not, through her campaign, she would not sit for an interview with me with the story. But in the interim of that request and the story coming out, she did an interview with the Daily, or not the Daily, the elections podcast with the New York Times. She did an interview and was on a cover for The Cut with New York Magazine. She did something with Essence, and
she was at a Lotto.
Yes.
What's her name?
Yeah.
She used to be Mulatto, but she changed her name. What's her name?
Lotto.
Sorry.
Lotto.
Lotto. My bad. I'm old. She was at a Lotto concert. I saw Ben Shapiro was very upset about that.
Sounds like something he'd be upset about. But so I'm gonna think about that, actually. I'm not sure.
Well, look, I do want to reiterate, I think that she's very talented, and part of my frustration with some of the substantive choices that she's made over the last few years is because I think that she has a ton of real natural talent. And before I think she was as much of a big name in Democratic Party politics, demonstrated a real capacity to speak to a lot of different kinds of people at once without alienating folks. And there was that quantity that Barack Obama had. And I was looking forward to seeing where that could take her and potentially take some important left political issues at the same time. So we'll be waiting with the rest of the world to see what the election results are. And I really appreciate you being here with us today, Brittany. Tell the people where to find you.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for having me. This was great. You can find me just on Twitter at Brittany A. Gibson, and at Politico at bgibson@politico.com if you have a tip.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. You guys all know this is a podcast that comes out twice a week. This is in all likelihood, I think, going to be a Monday episode. So thank you all for subscribing. But on the off chance that we reorder things a little bit, you can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week. That's 4 extra episodes a month. If you subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. You also get full video episodes. We'd love to see you over there in the Bad Faith community. Either way, take care. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.